Hello, and welcome to another episode of Book Central Inside the Pages. I'm your host, Abby, and today, we're diving into a part of the writing world that doesn't always get the spotlight it deserves: the art of editing. If you've ever picked up a book and marveled at how well the story flows, how characters seem so real, and how there's hardly a typo in sight, you've got editors to thank for that. Today's episode is all about understanding what goes on behind the scenes before a book hits the shelves. I'm joined by someone who knows this world inside out, Joshua Stevens. He's an experienced book editor, having worked on everything from fiction to non-fiction, across multiple genres. We're going to unpack the different types of editing, what each stage means for an author, and why they're all so important in shaping a book that captivates readers. Joshua, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Abby. I'm really excited to be here. Editing is such an important part of the book process, and I think a lot of people don't realize how much goes into it, so I'm looking forward to pulling back the curtain on that today.
Let's start by clarifying something I think a lot of people might get confused about. When people think of editing, they often assume it's just fixing spelling mistakes and grammatical errors, but editing is so much more than that, isn't it? Could you explain what editing really involves?
Absolutely. That's probably the biggest misconception I encounter as an editor. People think of editing as synonymous with proofreading, just looking for typos or fixing commas. But in reality, editing is a multi-layered process that starts way before you ever get to those final proofing stages. Editing involves shaping a manuscript on multiple levels. There's the big picture stuff, like whether the story makes sense or if the characters feel real. Then there's the finer work of making sure sentences flow well, ensuring the author's voice shines through, and, of course, fixing any grammatical issues. Proofreading is really just the final step in a much larger process.
That's so interesting. So what are the main types of editing that a manuscript typically goes through before it's ready for publication?
There are 4 primary types of editing, and each one has a different focus and purpose. First, we have developmental editing. This is where we look at the manuscript as a whole and focus on the big picture elements, things like plot structure, character development, pacing, and overall narrative cohesion. It's a very hands-on process, and sometimes it involves major rewrites or restructuring. Next is content editing, sometimes called line editing. Here, we're looking at the language itself, sentence structure, word choice, flow, and making sure the author's voice is clear and consistent throughout the manuscript. This stage is about tightening the prose and ensuring the language works for the story. Then we move on to copy editing, which is more technical. At this stage, the editor focuses on grammar, punctuation, spelling, and ensuring consistency in things like tone, terminology, or style. Finally, we have proofreading. This is the last step, and it's all about catching any last-minute typos, formatting issues, or minor errors that might have slipped through. It's the final polish before the book goes to print or gets published.
That's a great overview, Joshua. I want to start by digging a little deeper into each type of editing, starting with developmental editing. This sounds like a really crucial part of the process. What exactly does developmental editing involve, and why is it so important for authors to go through this stage?
Developmental editing is definitely one of the most crucial stages of editing. This is where an editor gets into the heart of the story. We're not just looking at whether a scene works or if the dialogue sounds natural. We're examining the entire structure of the manuscript. We look at whether the plot makes sense, if the pacing is effective, if the characters have enough depth, and whether their arcs are satisfying. Sometimes, we'll realize that certain plot points don't land, or that a character's motivation isn't clear, and that's where we'll suggest rewrites or even cutting scenes. What's important here is that developmental editing is very collaborative. The editor and author need to work closely together to ensure that the story is the best it can be. The feedback can be tough sometimes. It means cutting entire chapters or reworking key parts of the plot, but it's necessary. This is where the foundation for the rest of the book is built.
That sounds intense. Do you find that authors struggle with developmental edits, especially when they've worked so hard on certain scenes or characters? I imagine it's difficult for an author to hear that something they've written doesn't work.
Yes, it can definitely be tough. I think every author has at least one scene or character they're deeply attached to, and when an editor suggests cutting or changing something, it can feel like a personal blow. But it's important to remember that editing is a process of refining the story. Just because something doesn't work in its current form doesn't mean it's bad, it just needs to be adjusted or rethought to fit better with the overall narrative. I always tell authors that editing is like sculpting. You start with a block of marble, your first draft, and editing is the process of chiseling away everything that doesn't belong until what's left is a beautiful, polished piece of art. It can be painful, but it's necessary to get to the heart of the story.
That's a great analogy. Now let's move on to the next stage, line editing, which I believe is sometimes also called content editing. What's the focus at this stage, and how does it differ from developmental editing?
Line editing is all about the prose, how the sentences flow, whether the language is clear and engaging, and if the tone and style are consistent throughout the manuscript. While developmental editing looks at the big picture, line editing is more focused on the details of the writing itself. We're looking at sentence structure, word choice, and whether the language supports the overall mood and message of the book. It's an important stage because even if the story is solid, if the language is clunky or unclear, readers are going to struggle to engage with it. So we spend a lot of time here making sure that every sentence pulls its weight and that the author's voice comes through clearly.
So in line editing, you're really working on fine-tuning the language and making sure the author's style is consistent. What comes next, copy editing?
Yes, copy editing comes after line editing. While line editing is about the creative side of the writing, copy editing is more technical. This is where we focus on grammar, punctuation, spelling, and consistency. We check for things like whether a character's name is spelled the same throughout, if there are any timeline inconsistencies, or if the author is following the right style guide, whether that's Chicago, AP, or something else.
Copy editing sounds like a very meticulous process. How long does it usually take?
It can take a while, depending on the length and complexity of the manuscript. But it's an essential part of the process, because even the most beautifully written book can lose credibility if it's full of grammatical errors or inconsistencies. It's all about making sure the book is as polished and professional as possible before it moves into the final stage, proofreading.
Speaking of proofreading, let's talk about that next. What's involved in proofreading, and how is it different from the earlier stages of editing?
Proofreading is the very last stage of the editing process, and it's all about catching those final errors that might have slipped through. At this point, the story, structure, and language should all be set in stone. We're not making any more big changes, we're just looking for typos, formatting issues, or any small errors that could distract the reader. It's the final polish before the book goes to print or gets published.
And by this point, the book should be pretty close to perfect, right?
Exactly. Proofreading is all about making sure everything is as clean as possible. We're checking for things like double spaces, missing punctuation, or inconsistencies in font size. It's a meticulous process, but it's crucial because even small mistakes can pull a reader out of the story.
Joshua, this has been such an enlightening conversation. I think a lot of authors and aspiring writers are going to walk away from this episode with a much better understanding of the editing process and why it's so important. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts or advice for authors who might be listening?
My biggest piece of advice is to trust the process and not to rush it. Editing can take time, but it's where the magic really happens. You've spent months or even years writing your book, so don't skimp on the editing. Every author needs an editor. Even the best writers miss things in their own work because they're too close to it. Having an editor look at your manuscript objectively is one of the best ways to ensure your book reaches its full potential.
Thank you, Joshua. I think that's advice every writer should keep in mind. Editing might be the unsung hero of the publishing process, but it's absolutely vital to making a book shine. And thank you for being here today. It's been a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you, Abby. It was a pleasure to be here, and I hope this conversation helps authors understand the value of good editing.
That's it for today's episode of Book Central Inside the Pages. If you found this conversation helpful, make sure to subscribe to our podcast and follow us on social media for more tips and insider knowledge from the world of books. I'm Abby, and until next time, keep reading, and don't forget, every great book is the result of great editing.